So in a collision, remember, when two objects collide and they bounce off, which means they do not stick and move as one, that would be an elastic collision. But on the other hand, if two objects collide and they stick and move as one object, move as one item or one object after collision, that is most probably inelastic collision. Why? Because when they collide, for them to stick together, they need energy. Work has to be done. Work has to be done to cause them to stick. And whenever work is done, there's loss of kinetic energy. So that means during the process of sticking together, kinetic energy is lost. That makes it inelastic collision, because for elastic collision, kinetic energy is conserved. That's your explanation behind that. So that is one simple way of doing it. But if it comes out in an essay and you are supposed to determine whether a collision is elastic or inelastic, please calculate the total kinetic energy before collision, calculate the total kinetic energy after collision, compare if they are equal, conclusion, elastic collision. If they are not equal, which means after collision will always be less than before, then your conclusion will be inelastic collision. All right? Okay. Now, another point about collisions will be principle of conservation of momentum. All right. So let's talk about principle of conservation of momentum. All right. Principle of conservation of momentum, number one, has certain conditions. Condition number one is it has to be a closed system. All right. So here the closed system must be well understood. See, when you're talking about principle of conservation of momentum, you are talking about collisions. That means objects are colliding. You are talking about collisions. All right. Now, during a collision, all you got to figure out, all you got to analyze is during the collision, are the two objects subjected to, keyword, subjected to external force? Not force, but external force, because force got two, internal and external. Meaning when two objects collide, this object that is colliding will exert an action force on this object, which is inevitable. And in response, this object will react by exerting a force on this. That is called internal force. That will occur in any collision. That is okay. That is expected of. But what we are talking about, external force, when the two objects are colliding, are you using your hand force to push or pull the objects during the collision? That's external. Is there frictional force? That means while the objects are moving, is there a frictional force which is either slowing them down? All right, okay. If the frictional force exists, that frictional force is an external force. Let's say you're dropping one object, okay? You drop one object, it undergoes free fall, and imagine there's another object here, it goes and hits that object, and then they fall due to gravity. Gravitational force is an external force. During principle of conservation of momentum, you cannot have external force. That means the gravitational force cannot be included. That means gravitational force cannot be there during what you call principle, during collision. That means if you are going to determine principle of conservation of momentum and all that, you'll find that the principle of conservation of momentum will not be obeyed if gravitational force is present, if frictional force is present, if a hand force is exerted during the collision, because all these will alter the final velocity or the initial velocity. So because of that alteration, principle of conservation of momentum will not be obeyed. So that is why you need to stress the system must be closed in order to say no existence of external force, no frictional force, no gravitational force, no hand force, or whatsoever external force. All that must be absent. In that state, only in that state, principle of conservation of momentum will be obeyed. That is why a question can be asked. That means they can let two trolleys collide and all that during the collision. All right, during the collision. All right, they can ask. That means let's say they say the principle of conservation of momentum is obeyed, and then they can ask you, okay, give one condition for this to occur. You can say the surface on which the trolley is moving must be smooth. Why? Because there will be no frictional force, and frictional force is an external force. So by this case, we are keeping the system closed. All right. Now, if you are doing it on an inclined plane, then how? That's where you say you have to have a friction compensated inclined plane, where the inclined plane is inclined in such a way the gravitational force of the trolley or the object compensates the frictional force. So overall, there is no external force. There is no component of weight nor component of friction during the movement of the trolleys or during the collision of the trolleys on an inclined plane, because you are using a friction compensated inclined plane. This is all the ideas of a closed system.